Brazil, South Africa, you'd see that there's a marked change in terms of how the economy is doing, how the laws are doing in these countries, and there've been, an overall improvement and in terms of the legal framework and the structure in these jurisdictions. When it comes to competition law, there are competition laws existing in different shapes and forms in more than 130 countries. And of these, sort of we are one of the newcomers because almost two-thirds of these countries has had competition law for at least 2 to 3 decades, if not more, and therefore we are one of the latecomers who joined this, joined the bandwagon, and sort of it started sometime, when the government decided that it was time for liberalization, and which is when people started thinking about having a new law on which deals with competition law issues, and as a process, there was a committee which was set up which is known as Raghavan Committee, came out with a report saying that the earlier law in India, which sort of dealt with competition law in a very sort of a different manner, which you would know is known as Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act of 1969, has become obsolete, and they felt a need for us to revamp the entire structure to come out with a new law which could deal with both the anti-competitive practice as also merger control provisions which are missing in MRTP Act, and so the need was felt for India to have a new law on competition law, which is why by way of a bill, the Competition Act was introduced in the Parliament and finally passed. We call this as Competition Act 2002. Now, just in terms of genesis, again, although the bill was passed in 2002, there were a lot of concerns in the mind of industry in terms of how this law is going to be implemented, especially in terms of the powers that the regulator, which is formed under this act, which is called Competition Commission of India, would have while dealing with and approving M&A cases, mergers and acquisition related cases. And therefore, there was a lot of concerns that this would lead to red tapeism. The overall timelines for the signing of M&A transaction as also the closing may significantly increase in case the CCI takes longer than what is expected in terms of the approval. And because of these issues, it took a lot of time before the provisions, which the substantive provisions under the Competition Act was implemented, was enforced. And in fact, it was only in the year 2009, which is when the provisions which deals with cartels, vertical agreements, and abuse of dominance were enforced, were implemented, and the provisions which deals with merger control were implemented in 2011, June 2011. Now, with that background, other basic aspect of, I get this asked this this question, which is that why do you even need competition law? What does it bring to the table? Why do why is it necessary? I think a very short answer to that would be that it increases efficiency, which is that it leads to innovation, it preserves competition in the market, and therefore the customers get value for money. To give you an example, whilst in many of the countries, there was a time when even getting a scooter in India was a privilege, and it used to take a long time for one to even get it. You need to book well in advance, and there were just one or two companies which were selling scooters. Now, in terms of the innovation in this one product itself, whilst it something as simple as an indicator was introduced, and was made part of sort of scooter in about 1960s in other jurisdiction. For in India to it sort of it being added as a new feature took almost 2 decades after that. And the reason for that was that, well, there was no need for the competitors to innovate because there was no competition in the market. It was only after the liberalization, when there were new entities which started competing with the old ones, the incumbent, which is when there was competition and there was innovation, new features were added, and therefore what you got was value for your money. For the same money, while you were getting a particular product with 3 features, you would get another product with with multiple features. And therefore, first and foremost, what it does is it preserves competition, it increases efficiency of each of the entities or companies who are performing in a market, participating in a market, and it in turn leads to better product being provided to the customers. So that's the first basic sort of aspect of what competition law brings to table. Second is that it unleashes rivalry. I mean, for the longest period, that many of the sectors in India were sort of predominantly government driven sectors, where you would see a lot of public sector undertaking, both central government and state governments, who would be the most active and the most successful entities in this sector. By the advent of private companies, and by providing an equal platform, it led to a sort of a rivalry between, not just between the private companies, but private companies and public companies. So that's the second aspect. Third is that, whilst earlier public enterprises were sort of relying on just the government to protect them, that's no longer the case, which is that every public sector company today competes effectively with private company, and the products are interchangeable, and therefore, they are required to compete and to provide products which are, efficient, where the quality has been enhanced, and which are price competitive. So that's the third aspect. But most importantly, I think what it does is it fosters a culture of competition, which is that, it has positive impact on the business practices overall. It therefore makes sure that there is a competition law mindset in both, in terms of the business practices being followed, as also the new laws which are legislated, right? So because one of the aspects of competition law is not just to preserve competition, but to ensure, by way of advocacy, that the new laws or the old laws, which may in the hindsight be leading to reduction in the competition, are getting either are modified, so that those provisions or aspects of those laws are revised, or that a new law is legislated. So these are the sort of basic aspects of competition law and why we require competition law. Now, jumping straight into the provisions, as I said, there are 3 substantive provisions under the Competition Act. One is Section 3, which is again divided into 2 parts. Section 3(3) of the Act, which deals with cartels and horizontal agreements. Section 3, subsection 4, which deals with vertical agreements. And Section 4, which deals with abuse of dominant provisions. Now, what I would do is that in this lecture, because we have paucity of time, and perhaps we may not be able to cover the entire sort of gamut of horizontal agreement, vertical abuse of dominance, and merger control. What I'm going to do is focus purely on just the horizontal vertical agreements and abuse of dominance in this session. Now, first and foremost, as I mentioned already, CCI, Competition Commission of India, is the nodal authority which enforces the competition law provisions in India. Section 3(3), as I said, deals with horizontal agreements and cartels. Now, what are cartels? Basically, cartels as a concept is, covers those situations or those kind of arrangements which take place between 2 competitors. When there are 2 competitors who are entering into some kind of understanding, and this understanding could be either in writing or oral, where such understanding or agreement leads to one of the five things, four or five things. One, it leads to fixing of prices, or B, it leads to control in terms of production or dispatch of any of the goods. If it leads to allocation of the customers, if it leads to allocation of territories, or if it leads to bid rigging, then these kind of arrangement between the competitors are called cartels and are considered anti-competitive in violation of the Competition Act. Now, just to give you a very basic example, if there are two or three competitors in a particular market, and they decide, they meet one day, or some of the senior executives of these entities meet and say, we are unnecessarily fighting and competing with each other. What if we decide to, just increase the prices by 10%, and everyone implements it? And this is a form of cartelization, where you fix the price and decided to increase the price. And this increase of price is of course artificial in nature, which is that it's not driven by any other need, but to ensure that everyone in the process increases their profitability. This does not lead to reduction in prices. So overall, it's going to impact the customers, but it's good news for the companies who are operating in this market. So this is one example. The second would be, well, there are various, there are three major entities, one headquartered in, say, for example, Delhi, the other one headquartered in Bombay, the third one headquartered in Chennai. And they decide, while we are competing with each other on an all India market, and it's becoming counterproductive, let us divide the market, which is that I will overall focus, the company which is headquartered in Delhi decides that they are going to focus on the northern India market. The company headquartered in Mumbai decides that they're going to only focus on the central Indian market, and the company headquartered in Chennai decides that they're going to focus on the South India market. Now, by doing this, they've effectively ensured that the customer, say, sitting in Bombay, will no longer get the products of competitor A sitting in, or company A which is in Delhi, and company C which is in Chennai. So therefore, reduction in the choices of goods, which will also involuntarily lead to these companies now free to increase the prices. So they can decide that, okay, I was selling my product for 100 rupees. Now I'll decide I will start selling it for 130 rupees, because there is no one to question me. They have no other choice. If they want a particular product, they will have to buy from me. So this is another example of cartelization. Now, as is the case in any jurisdiction, cartels and horizontal agreements, and again, horizontal agreements is a term used for agreements between players who are at the same level of production, and therefore the term horizontal. So the agreements between competitors are always termed as horizontal agreement. Now, under the Competition Act, as is the case in various other jurisdictions, I think this is one conduct which is frowned upon by antitrust authorities across the world, including in India, and therefore, under the Competition Act, a cartel is considered a per se offense, which means that the moment it is established that there was an arrangement between the parties where they decided to increase the price or allocate the market, the impact of that, whether there was any impact of that agreement or not, is inconsequential, and there will be a cartel finding and a penalty that will be imposed in such cases. Now, in terms of deterrent, whether this is deterrent enough or not, well, in practice, of course, there haven't been too many cases where the CCI has successfully realized the penalties, which is that a lot of cases have been either stuck at the appellate tribunal level or before the Supreme Court. Hopefully, some of them will be decided soon. But it has not led to actual realization of penalty to the CCI and the government. But under the law, under Section 27 of the Competition Act, the CCI has the power to impose penalty of either 10% of the total turnover of the company for the period in which the cartel exists, or 3 times the profit that each of the company has generated during the tenure of the cartel, whichever is higher. So it could lead to significant penalties. For example, if there is a company whose year annual turnover is say 10,000 crores, could potentially and say profit of about 2,000 crores per year, and they say the cartel continued for just 1 year, their penalty could be as high as either 10% of 10,000 being 1,000 crores, or 3 times the profit. And if the profit was 2,000 crores, could be as high as 6,000 crores. So you can sort of, I just wanted to give you the perspective of how significant the monetary penalty could be. Of course, under competition law, there are few countries like USA where cartel offense is considered a penal offense. Similarly, in UK, where cartel offense is a penal offense, which also means that the executives or directors who are involved in such cartel activity can actually be sent behind bars. In India, cartel is a civil offense under the Competition Act, and therefore, you only have monetary consequences to a cartel finding. Now, can the penalty be imposed only on the company? The answer is no. In addition to the company, those people who were either in charge of the company, including the directors and other office bearers, who took the decision in such cartel, or with whose consent a cartel or an anti-competitive agreement took place, can also be penalized under the Competition Act, separate from the company. CCI also has the power to take other measures against these office bearers and the directors, including in 1 or 2 cases, 2 cases in fact, I'm sorry, 3 cases dealing with trade associations. The CCI had in fact ordered that particular office bearers who were involved in a cartel like activity cannot will have to give up on their position in the trade association, and also imposed another direction, another sort of a penalty, where they barred these office bearers from assuming similar roles for a period of 2 years. So it goes just beyond the monetary penalty and could impose other penalties, which could be problematic for senior executives. So penalty can be imposed both on company as well as individuals. Section 3, as I mentioned, is a per se offense, which means that once it is established that there was an agreement, you will be penalized for such an offense. And as I said, under the Competition Act, because it's the violation of competition law is a civil offense and not penal offense. Therefore, the standard of evidence required to prove whether there was a cartel or there was a vertical agreement which led to and appreciable adverse effect on competition, or that there is an entity which abused its dominant position, the standard of evidence is not beyond reasonable doubt, which is the standard you will see in penal provisions. The standard here is a preponderance of probability, which is that as long as there are enough facts which shows that there could have been a cartel, or if everything points in the direction of a cartel, even in the absence of a smoking gun evidence. And what is a smoking gun evidence? So let me give you an example of one of the most famous cases, which is the cement cartel case. While there have been 2 or 3 cartel cases in the cement industry, I think the most famous is the Builders Association of India case, where when the investigation started, before I go into how the investigation goes, whilst I am guessing you will be aware of the framework within the CCI in terms of how the CCI investigation takes place. So I'm not going into the actual procedural aspects of it, but the only thing I'll say is that when an information is filed with the CCI, it can either take a view that there is prima facie there is no case of violation and close the such information under section 26(2) of the Competition Act, or it can send the matter for a detailed investigation in case it comes to the conclusion that prima facie there may be conduct may be in violation of the law and merits a detailed investigation. So the moment the order is passed under section 26(1) for detailed investigation, the matter goes to the Office of Director General, which is the investigative arm of the CCI, which has the mandate to investigate such cases. The DG, the Director General Office, then investigates the case and comes out with a report. That report is shared with by the CCI with both the parties, the informant as also the opposite parties. And then there is a hearing process, after which the CCI passes its final order. So now, as I was saying, in the cement case, the CCI directed that there will be a detailed investigation. The DG office conducted the investigation, came out with a report, and then there was a hearing. But without going into what the findings of the DG was, the final finding of the CCI was that they came to the conclusion that there was 11 cement companies in India which were cartelizing, and the evidence that they were taking and that they took into consideration is as follows. One, the CCI considered the minutes of meetings of of a particular trade association. In this case, it was the Cement Manufacturers Association, CMA, which is a trade association where all of these companies used to meet on a frequent basis. And they looked at the some of the minutes and meetings where they found that immediately after the meeting used to take place, you would see an increase in the price by all these companies. That was the first evidence they took. So there was nothing in the minutes of the meetings to suggest that they decided to increase prices. But the trend suggested that immediately after the meeting, the price would increase. The second fact that CCI took into consideration is that typically October is the season when there is an increase in the demand for cement. September, October, for various reasons, including the fact that it's a festive season, people start sort of the construction activity, and therefore the demand for cement typically increases. And this was based on the empirical data that was collected by the DG. They said that in particular year, in 1 year, which was an anomaly, which is that every year the demand increased, and therefore when the demand increased, as you know, the supply will also increase. But there was one particular year where the demand increased, but the supply decreased rather than increasing. For all these companies, the supply decreased. And it's a simple demand and supply game, which is that if the demand is more and the supply is less, the prices are going to increase. So that led to an inference that because of this reduction in the supply, the prices shot up, and therefore all these companies benefited. There was other evidences also that CCI took into consideration, including the fact that, well, the capacity utilization of all of these companies was not 100%. So in any factory, there is a limit, there is a capacity to which a factory could produce a particular product or unit. Now, in terms of percentages for each of these companies, the capacity utilization was only hovered around 65 to 80%, which means that there was no reason for the price to increase, because they could have increased their production to meet the demand. But they, rather than increasing the production, actually reduced the production, reduced the supply, and which led to increase in the prices. So these were the factors and evidences that the CCI took into consideration, saying while there is no smoking gun evidence, and by smoking gun evidence I mean the direct evidence which shows, there are audio recordings that they all decided that we will increase prices, or we are going to cartelize, or there are documentary evidence to suggest that they are going to indulge in a cartel-like activity. But there are other facts which, if you look at holistically, proves that they would have done this conduct would be done only for the purposes of cartelizing, or there is no other logical justification for them to have behaved in a particular manner, but for the fact that there was some kind of an arrangement between them to increase prices, is what the CCI took into consideration while considering whether there was a cartel or not. And in this case, of course, the CCI found a cartel and imposed a penalty on of roughly 6,300 crores, if my memory serves well, on the which is the total amount imposed on the 11 cement companies. And there was a penalty imposed on the trade association as well for performing the platform where such activity took place. Now, so that was section 3.3. I'll pause here in case you have any questions. If you do, please feel free to speak, or I am happy to take the questions even at a later stage.
Thanks, Bharat. Because some of the students, they are approaching me, can we ask question right now? So I have asked them to wait till end. However, now I'll ask Miss Anjana Kameshwari, if you had some question, you can please shoot your question, Anjana. Anjana?
Yeah,
can you
yes, I have put it in the message box, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So question is, does the commission have unlimited powers in terms of taking action when they come across cartels or anti-competitive agreements? So the first question is unlimited powers. Well, they don't have unlimited powers in the sense that what could be the consequence in terms of the penalty is provided under the act itself. So yes, they have very wide powers, yes, in terms of the monetary penalty that they can impose. The commission also has the power to conduct raids. So just like income tax authorities, the CCI through its Office of Director General can conduct raids on the office premises, as also including the residential premises of certain companies and the office bearers or officials of those companies, to see in case they suspect that a particular company is engaged in any anti-competitive behavior. So well, they don't have unlimited powers, but yes, they do have wide powers, which they have imposed from which they've used from time to time to impose penalty on various entities. The second question is, what do you think is the biggest loophole in the competition law today? I think the biggest loophole in the competition law today, if you ask me, is the fact that there is no power today with the CCI to for settlement or commitment, which is what leads to a lot of cases after the CCI going to the appellate tribunal and then all the way to the Supreme Court. Whereas I think if there was a provision which by the way now is being contemplated under the competition bill, if it sort of is presented before the parliament and it gets sort of passed, then there is a provision in the bill which was supposed to be introduced in 2020, whereby the CCI will now have power to settle cases, which is that or offer commitment or take commitments from the companies, which leads to unnecessary litigation, right? If a company knows that they were involved in a particular activity, and they think rather than fighting this case all the way from tribunal to the Supreme Court, it makes better commercial sense to settle a particular investigation, then I think it would lead to a lot of cases being settled fast, which is a power that is missing today. So I would say the power to settle and a power to sort of settle the cases at the CCI level itself is one of the biggest loophole today, as far as the Competition Act is concerned. Whether there is a third question is, you mentioned whether there is an impact on the agreement is inconsequential in terms of determining cartel, but isn't that a very thin line? Can companies seek any other defense? Well, so the companies in few cases have tried, which is that, okay, there was a bid rigging, for example, there's a bid rigging case, and I'll be happy to share the names with Anindya later on of some of the important cases. But there's a case where, the allegation was there were few companies which entered into bid rigging. Bid rigging, as you would know, as a concept, is basically there are different type of bid rigging, but there are three, say, for example, three competitors A, B, C decide that rather than competing for a particular tender, they are going to enter into an arrangement where, say, of the three, only one will bid for a particular tender, and say A will bid for the first time, he gets the tender. Next time there is a bid, it's B's turn. Next time it is C's turn, which leads to allocation of various bids between the parties. It means that whatever the bid amount is, if the tenderer has the urgent need for a particular product or goods or services, then he will have to go and take services from that particular bidder. So there was a case where the party said, well, these bids where there is a we have found that there was a cartel that was found with respect to a particular bid, was actually that bid that tender never took place, in the sense that the companies decided not to go ahead with the tender. So therefore there was no impact felt of actual impact felt of this cartel. But under the act, and this is again something that sees the Supreme Court of India also in the famous coordination committee case has held that under the provisions of the act, the fact that there was a cartel, once it is proved that there was a cartel, whether there was any impact or not becomes inconsequential, because the intent was there. The intent was there to cartelize. It is another thing, for some reasons the tender did not take place, but let's assume that the tender had taken place. You can't say that the fact that the tender did not take place means there is no malfide on your part, because you of course intended, and there are all the evidence that the CCI has collected that you actually intended to cartelize in a particular situation. So it is a thin line, in the sense that between whether the CCI is convinced or not in a particular case. And that's where the role of lawyers come, which is, if there are enough doubts, if there are other logical justifications or commercial justifications for why three companies acted the way they acted, then of course that those justification could be given. For example, again, the cement case that I was talking about, where the CCI found that the capacity utilization was that the cement prices increased after certain meetings of the trade association. The justification that people gave was, they said that, look, the taxes increased, so therefore everyone had to increase the prices. With respect to reduction in capacity utilization, few companies said, well, in one of the companies' case, they gave the evidence that, look, I had to shut down my plant because there was an urgent maintenance required, and they have all the documents to suggest that. So it is always, you proving and disproving a particular, issue. Now, of course, therefore, it becomes very tricky when you come to cartel cases. Because of course CCI is generally, you will not find a smoking gun evidence. Generally, no one will be stupid enough to actually leave a paper trail or an audio recording where it established that there is a cartel which had been formed between the parties. Typically, these are all oral discussions taking place in a particular restaurants. Very difficult to sort of prove. But that's how that's how the regulators in various jurisdictions work. Let me give you one more quick example and then move on to the next question, which is that in Europe there was a case where the European Commission, when investigating the case, found out that there were three CEOs of three major companies who sort of were in the same line of business. These three CEOs were also friends, and they used to go on an annual trip every year, the three of them. And every time they used to come back from that annual trip, you would see that the prices of the product increased. All three increased prices. So while there was no direct evidence, but the trend suggested that what happens when they go, there's some discussion that take place when they go for their annual trip, and immediately after that everyone increases prices simultaneously. That was enough evidence to prove that there is a cartel. So yes, the next question. EU has the strongest and most stringent laws in terms of competition. Any particular provision from EU or any other competition law for that matter that you think? So our law is majorly, I think our provisions and the provisions in the European competition law are pretty much similar. So I don't think there is anything else that we could have introduced in terms of substantive law. So there's nothing that comes to mind where we would be better off implementing in terms of provisions under the EU law. Next question. My question seeks your opinion whether this COVID-19 restriction impact on business will lead to more incidents of cartels. Good question, and yes, it could lead to cartels. COVID-19 restriction. It could also lead to genuine case for coordination. So in fact, the Competition Commission of India in April of 2020 came out with a guidance note, where they said that it's a pandemic year. There may be actual genuine need for the competitors to coordinate. I mean, if you remember the first lockdown, there were no choices for biscuits also. I mean, you would typically just get one brand of biscuits in a particular, sometimes even not, even that was difficult. And therefore, because of a complete disruption in the distribution chain, I mean, just giving you an example, if there are two competitors who are using the same vehicle or transport vehicle or logistics chain to supply their products because of the restrictions, then that's something that the CCI recognized is a genuine need for coordination. In a normal world, while this could have been potentially problematic, they said that if you take any measures, or for example, say two pharma companies who were supplying a life-saving drug in a part, in say in a remote part of the country, and because of the disruption now, there's two competitors can't find separate trucks, and they where one has a truck available, can the other one coordinate with them to use the same truck to to send these life-saving drugs? The answer is yes, you can do that, and something the CCI said they will take into consideration in case there is any information brought to their notice alleging that this actually is cartelization. So, but yes, apart from this also, there could be reasons for and more incidents for cartels given the COVID situation. But if there is a genuine need for why people had to coordinate or their activities, then I guess it could be justified. But of course, it could lead to more cases of cartels which cannot be justified in any other manner. Well, Anjana, if you don't mind, because we are short of time, I would prefer that to just cover the other two provisions quickly, and perhaps I can take these questions offline with you. Great. Okay. So moving on, I think so. This is all about horizontal agreements. Vertical agreements, as the name suggests, is at a vertical level. And what is vertical level? Basically, any kind of agreements that take place between parties who are at different value chain in terms of production of a particular good are vertical agreements. For example, if there is a supplier of a raw product, and which is used by a manufacturer to manufacture a particular product, that they are at vertical level. Or the manufacturer of a particular product, say manufacturer of a mobile phone, which has various distributors who actually distribute the mobile phones to retailers, the relationship between this manufacturer and the distributor is a vertical relationship. There are certain types of vertical agreements which are considered anti-competitive. But one important thing to note here is, unlike horizontal agreements, which are per se violative, vertical agreements are not per se violative, which is that basically means that the rule of reason applies, which is that in case the vertical agreements will only be anti-competitive if it leads to what is known as an appreciable adverse effect on competition. AAEC is what we call it in short. And there are factors provided under Section 19 of the Competition Act. But unless it leads to AEC, vertical agreements are otherwise not considered anti-competitive. And what are these vertical agreements? To give you a few examples, any agreement between the acquirer and the manufacturer and the distributor or a retailer, to the effect that there is a tie-in arrangement, which is that if you want to buy my product A, you will also have to purchase product B from me. Or if the manufacturer is supplying the product directly to the end customer, in case product A is available only and only when the customer also buys product B, then that's an example of tie-in or bundling. The other example could be where there is an exclusive supply or a distribution agreement, where if there is a long-term distribution, say if, for example, a particular sports body has a agreement for broadcast of certain sports events, and therefore is coming out with is awarding contractual rights for a broadcast of those events, and this time period for this event is 20 years, which is that only a particular channel can show the events taking place in India for in a particular sports category for 10 years or 20 years, is a case of long-term exclusive supply agreement, a distribution agreement, which is where CCI can consider this as an agreement which leads to AEC, because it denies market opportunity to the other competitors. If there are other sports broadcasters, they will not be able to telecast the same event, because you have tied yourself, you have exclusively there is an exclusive relationship between the sports authority and the broadcasters for a period of 20 years. So another example of AEC. But without going too much into the details of this, typically vertical agreements are not found to be problematic unless the entity which is imposing such a restriction has a significant market power, which leads us to the next provision, which is Section 4, which deals with abuse of dominance position. Now, abuse of dominant position is basically an provision where, assuming you are a dominant entity, there are certain conducts mentioned under Section 4 which will be considered as anti-competitive. Now, what is a dominant entity? A dominant entity is an entity which has significant market power with respect to a particular product or services. Now, is there a threshold provided under the Act in terms of what that market power could be, or a market share? The answer is that there is no threshold provided under the Act, which is that if a particular entity is in telecom sector, say, with a 40% market share, will it be considered as dominant? Well, unlike, say, Europe, where typically about 35%, if you have a market share about 35%, then you are likely to be considered dominant entity. There is no bright line test in the Competition Act in India. So one, of course, is the market share. That there is no test for what is dominance, but typically under the Competition Act, if you have a market share of above 40%, or you otherwise have other factors of dominance, which is that you have huge supply of a particular resource or raw material, then you could be considered as dominant entity. You could be dominant in one sector, but leveraging your dominance in another sector. So it could be economic power, it could be power of multiple resources, it could be the power in terms of your market share. All of this could be taken into consideration to determine whether you're dominant or not. And dominance of an entity has to be in a product market, and which is a very important aspect of what is a product market. Product market comprises a relevant product market comprises of relevant relevant market comprises of relevant product market and geographic market. So all the goods, all the products which the consumer finds interchangeable will comprise part of the same market. For example, is a pencil and a ballpoint pen and an ink pen all part of the same market? Well, they are all used for the same purpose, but there could be an argument that a pencil is a separate market than a ballpoint pen and an ink pen, right? Because they're not substitutable. If you are writing an exam, perhaps you may not be able to use pencil. You will have to use a ballpoint or an ink pen or some other kind of pen. So therefore, one could distinguish the two. And then the question is whether all of these pen are in the same market, same product market. Ink pen, say for example, ink pen and a ballpoint pen. Again, they could be considered as part of the same market if the consumers find it interchangeable. Then there could be another cut, which is that, well, a ballpoint pen and an ink pen is substitutable if they are both available in a particular price range, which is that if a customer wants to buy a pen for 10 rupees and there is a ballpoint pen available for 10 rupees and there is an ink pen available for 100 rupees, for the customer, perhaps the two pens may not be interchangeable just because there is a wide difference in terms of the price of both the products. Or for example, if there are two types of perfumes available and one is costing 200 rupees and the other one is a luxury product cost to 10,000 rupees or 6,000 rupees, then the two may not be found to be part of the same market because it's not substitutable if you take into consideration the price points at which these products are sold. So you need to be dominant, taking into consideration the relevant product, and therefore the definition of how you define the market. The broader you get, perhaps your market share is going to decrease. The narrower you go into the product, perhaps your market share is going to increase. So that's the first. It's a function of relevant product market and also relevant geographic market. Now, what is relevant geographic market? Well, the geographic market basically means that it comprises all the geographies where the condition of competition is homogeneous, which means if I want to have Pani Puri, say today and I'm sitting in Bombay and I want to have Pani Puri, a person who's selling Pani Puri in Pune is of no use to me, and therefore in terms of the geography I will not consider Mumbai and Pune as the same market if I need to say have Pani Puri. Even in with respect to Bombay, I may not want to travel for more than 2 kilometers to have Pani Puri. So if I am sitting in say Bandra, a Pani Puri wala sitting in Kolaba may not be substitutable for me. Or for example, theater, if I want to watch a movie, perhaps I will have a 10-kilometer radius within which I would want to travel. So another theater which is 30 kilometers away may not be substitutable for me. That's how you look at geographic market. So it's a function of relevant product market. So first you come to the conclusion on what is the product you are talking about. Is that a unique product which forms market for itself, or are there multiple products which has to be clubbed together to look at the market size and the market shares? And the second is, what is the geography that you need to take into consideration? Is it an all India market? Is it a particular city? Is it a particular state? Is it just a particular area in a city? So there are various permutation, combination, and changes from case to case. So therefore, depending on the facts of the case, the target in question, the company in question, the geographic market and the relevant market would change. Well, once you have come to a conclusion that you are dominant and in a particular market, then the second question is what kind of conduct would be problematic under the Competition Act. And under the Competition Act, any terms and conditions which are unfair or discriminatory in terms of purchase or sale of goods. So any terms and conditions which are unfair or discriminatory, or any terms and conditions in terms of price could be problematic. Any predatory pricing, which is that a dominant entity selling a particular product below the average variable cost, below the cost of production, that is, would be abuse of dominance. Any conduct on part of a dominant entity which has an effect of creation of entry barrier would again be problematic. And the last one is any attempt on the part of a dominant entity to leverage its dominant position in one market to increase its market share or to enter into a separate market is another conduct which is considered abuse of dominance. I will not go into the details of it because of paucity of time, but maybe just give you one or two examples. With respect to, say, predatory pricing. Now, predatory pricing, is a concept where, say, the cost of production for a particular good is 100 rupees. I typically sell it in the market for 140 rupees. I have a 60% market share, and there are two other competitors, each having, say, 30% and 10% market share respectively. I decided it's time for me to move on and to sort of increase my presence and dominance in the market. What I start doing is, say if I was selling my 100 rupee product at 140 rupees and the other competitors were also selling around the same price, I will suddenly reduce my price of the product to, say, 90 rupees. Now, with the intent, of course, that I will drive out the competitors, which is that I have deep pockets. I know I can sustain. There will be losses, but I can sustain. I can manage for a period of, say, 6 months or a year to sell it at a 90 rupee price. But I also know that my competitors cannot sustain, and therefore either they will shut the shop, or I may have an opportunity to acquire there. And once the other competitors are out of the market, my market share is going to increase from 60% to 90% or even 100%. At that time, I will become sort of a monopoly, and therefore there is no one to compete with, and I can increase my prices and I can recoup the losses that I've suffered for a period of 6 months or 1 year. I can recoup that and recover those losses at a later time, because what I was selling for 130 rupees, which I reduced to 90, now I can sell at 200 rupees also, because the customer has no choice. So this is one example of what could be abuse of dominance. The other example is where, say, for example, the BCCI case, where the Competition Commission of India said, well, BCCI entered into an arrangement for with a particular media broadcaster for telecast of Indian Premier League, IPL, and one of the clause in this agreement between the broadcaster and the BCCI said that BCCI will not sanction or introduce any other cricketing event which competes with IPL for a period of 10 years. And there the CCI said, look, BCCI, you are dominant when it comes to the market of administration of cricket in India. You are also therefore a regulator of cricket, so to speak, in India. You have imposed a condition on yourself to say that you will not either start another competition which rivals IPL, but you will also not sanction. And your sanction is required because you not only control cricket in India, you have a direct affiliation with ICC, and all the players which are BCCI contracted players cannot play without your permission. And to the extent that therefore a new party cannot come and organize a similar cricket event is an entry barrier that you have created in the market, because no other tournament can come in the market, and this is therefore abuse of dominant position. So this is another example of where the CCI, of how and why CCI can consider, a particular conduct as in violation of Section 4 of the Act. Last but not the least, let me give you an example of the case against National Stock Exchange, where National Stock Exchange, there was a rival in the market, sometime in early 2000, I think 2007 or 8, where MCX is one of the entity which started its business in India. And MCX is a stock exchange which only deals with commodities market. And there are various segments. There could be equity market, there's debt market, there's commodity market. MCX started working only in the commodities market. NSE was very strong when in the equity market and also in the debt market, but was not very strong when it came to the commodity market. Now, for trading in these markets, what used to happen is that each of these players, MCX, NSE, BSE, they were providing platforms, softwares from where you can trade. Now, MCX used to charge a nominal amount for use of such software by the customers, because it was a new entity and could not, there was cost attached to that software, and therefore they had to pass on the cost. Therefore, if you were trading on MCX, you had to give a cost, a price on the usage of that software. What NSE started doing is to lure the customers from MCX. They started providing a similar software free of cost, which is that, they said, there's no zero transaction charges. You are free to use this software without any cost. And MCX started feeling the pinch, because the market share started decreasing, which is then they went to the CCI saying, look, this is abuse of dominance, because they are leveraging their position. They have high market share in another segment, the equity segment and the debt segment, and they're leveraging their dominant position because they have strong financial backing and reserves to ensure that I go out of market. I'm a new player. There is a cost attached to a software. I cannot provide it for free. Even for them, they are using this. There is a cost attached to the software that they're providing. But the only reason they can provide it for free is because they are, ready to bear losses for a short time, because they know once the customer moves, they will have a significant market share even in the commodities exchange market, which is where CCI found that yes, the conduct on part of NSE was in fact abusive, and they imposed penalty on them. This case moved to the NCLAT, and for the longest time it was before NCLAT. Now the case is pending before the Supreme Court, but hopefully the order should come out sometime this year itself. So again, some of the examples of when the CCI has found the conduct of a dominant entity to be abusive, but I think we have no time left, so I'll stop here in case there are any questions with respect to section 3 and 4. And what we'll do is, perhaps I'll try and cover provisions relating to merger control in another session which we could conduct in next few weeks.
Absolutely, Bharat, we can do that, and we would love to have you again with GD Goenka for our next session. But before that, I have a personal question. I have seen in many competition law cases that CCI, they put up a large and huge fine on the bodies or the entities who are violating these conditions. But NCLT, I have seen there is a tendency that they turn this whole fine into a very small amount. So it seems to be defeating the purpose of the legislation, isn't it?
You're right. I mean, I think there have been cases where there has been either reduction on penalty, but I think part of it has to also do with the fact that CCI lacks a penalty guideline, which is that in a particular case, whether the penalty should be 10% or 8% or 5% or 2%. There's no guideline. So there's no, while CCI tries to provide justifications for why they think a particular penalty in a particular case be 10%. But because of the lack of guidelines, typically you will see parties, arguing before NCLAT that even if the case was against me, I don't think this case merited a 10% penalty. And more often than not, the regulator, the appellate tribunal may be happy to reduce the penalty amount, the penalty percentage. It sort of defeats the purpose, but I think it is the lack of penalty guidelines which lead to such situations. If there are objective justifications, then I think the tribunals may shy away from reducing the penalty. Of course, on a case-to-case basis, there will always be an argument for reduction, but the trend may become looks slightly skewed with that. A lot of cases where penalty was imposed as 10% has been reduced. significantly, that may come down. And secondly, as I mentioned, I think, in fact, I have a problem with this entire litigation, where every case being challenged before the NCLAT and then going to the Supreme Court itself. And I think that is where we feel that there is a need for settlement process, where if the parties feel that okay, I am better off just paying the penalty and I can negotiate on the penalty amount, that rather than imposing 77 penalty at 7%, I am ready to settle it at 5%. It is easier for the CCI, because you recover the money. It creates a precedent in the market. People know that I can also be penalized, and at the same time they save the time and the energy of going through the entire legal process of appellate tribunal and then the Supreme Court. So I think it's partly to do with the fact that there are no penalty guidelines, partly to do with the fact that there is no provision under which you can settle the cases.
Thanks. Do we have any question from students or any faculty member?
I have a question, a very general question to you.
Ma'am, please go ahead.
Does competition law allows competing researchers to collaborate on COVID-19 vaccines?
Well,
I'll repeat once again. Yes.
No, I've understood your question. So whether 3 separate pharmaceutical companies can collaborate to develop a new vaccine, there is a concept under the Competition Act which is called under Section 3.3, and good you pointed this out. Actually, under Section 3.3 of the Act, when there is a which deals with cartels and horizontal agreements, there is a defense available, an exception, which is that if there is coordination and agreement between the competitors by way of a joint venture, and it need not be a formal joint venture, which is that you don't need to set up a joint venture entity, but any kind of joint venture initiative between the parties which leads to efficiency in the market is not considered anti-competitive. That's one. Second, as I said, in situations like this, when there are objective reasons for why the entities could collaborate with each other, the CCI would consider these efficiencies while coming to a consideration whether this is in fact violation of law or not. So if there is collaboration between various pharma companies by way of joint ventures, and there's no doubt it is for a good cause, and it brings efficiency because you are bringing the expertise of various pharmaceutical companies, the R&D cost may come down, the time may come down, and therefore there are actual efficiencies arising out of such collaboration. Then such collaboration, to my mind, would not fall foul of the provisions under the Competition Act. I hope
we have any other question?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any other question?
Yes, thank you.
So I believe we have none. So this brings us to the conclusion of this webinar session. I would take this opportunity to thank Bharat. Although from the deep corner of my heart, I know that I don't have to thank Bharat. He is a friend, and I can at any point of time call him to help me out with these sessions. But then also for the purpose of formality, Bharat, let me thank you on behalf of the whole GD Goenka team, Faculty of Law. Your session has been very useful for us, and it has been informative. And the students, they are messaging me continuously. So you might have seen me referring to my cell phone. They are messaging me with the questions, but I'm telling them, okay, we'll have another session. Although we wanted you to be in our campus physically, let this COVID-19 pass out. We'll definitely invite you physically in our campus, and there will be much more interactive session and a much better session than this online one. Thanks again, Bharat, for this session.
Thanks, Anand, and of course, look forward to meeting all of you in person.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, all the students, all the faculty members. Thank you, everyone.